Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Josh Wonders Why. So glad you decided to take some time out of your busy schedule, hectic lives to join us in the virtual world of Facebook Live to have a good conversation tonight.
Good conversation.
I'm joined as usual with Pastor Kelly, and she's going to come with all the answers to all of our questions tonight.
Wait. I never said I had all the answers.
So, if you're new to this experience, Josh Wonders Why is mostly a weekly discussion we have on not Wednesdays, Monday nights at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, just on a variety of topics. Could be religion, could be current events, could be food, whatever's on our mind. And for the most part, try to do Mondays, but occasionally we have to take a Monday off because of our schedules. But tonight, or this month, I guess, since it is June and it is Pride Month, I feel like we should unpack a couple reasons why Christians may disagree or condemn the LGBT community. Mm-hmm. And tonight's discussion will focus on one of those, which is the argument of biblical marriage. Does the Bible say specifically this is what marriage is and this is what marriage isn't? That's what I'd like to unpack tonight. Before I guess we get started, maybe just as a start, or I don't know what to say, but I think we can both say that we're both pro-LGBT, mm-hmm. and we'll come out pretty LGBTQIA+. We'll come out pretty clear in this discussion, but I want to come out just
allies.
Yeah, allies. Yes, that's a better way of putting it. So tonight, wanted to focus on a biblical marriage and just discuss that. And like I said, Kelly will have all the answers for us and help to answer all the questions. Now, why did I pick biblical marriage? As I was looking for some of these topics to discuss, something that came out, it seems like some Christians take more of a traditional interpretation of biblical verses, Bible verses like the story of Adam and Eve in Genesis, or the story of how marriage is like Christ's love for us in Ephesians. Mm-hmm. And these Bible verses, how they interpret them, they suggest that God's design, God's intent is that marriage is a sacred union between one man and one woman, and anything other than that goes against God's design and God's natural order, is their argument. Mm-hmm. And then because of that, if people start to support the LGBTQIA+ community, that will start to challenge the status quo, the social norm, and cause moral decay based on how they think biblical marriage needs to be and how the Bible says a family unit needs to be. And the concern is that could be a slippery slope where, as we start accepting LGBT rights, we could lead to broader social changes like polygamy or some other non-traditional relationships, right? Mm-hmm. So it's slippery slope. Other concern could be that these same-sex couples, as they raise children, will the children also turn out to be gay? Or will there be psychological damage because these children are raised by a normal man-woman heterosexual relationship, I guess I'll say. So with that introduction, I'd like to unpack this and understand what the Bible really says about marriage. And if you're watching us, if you have any questions about this topic, feel free to chime in. We'd love to answer yours. Or comments, yes. Yep. Put anything together. So let's first start with the big question.
Tony wants to know, did Adam and Eve ever get married?
That's a good question.
Good question. I don't know. I guess if they were the only two, it kind of didn't matter.
That's a good point. Were they...
wasn't like they were going to, cheat with somebody else.
So Cain and Abel were born from unwed parents. Interesting. So. That's an interesting point, Tony. I never considered that.
When did this, rite of marriage come about?
Yeah. That's a good question. I did not think about asking that tonight, but I probably should have, because I don't know where the history of marriage is.
I didn't think about that either.
Maybe we can table that. So that's the first big question. Maybe the main question is, how does the Bible define marriage? And I'm hoping you, being a theologian, a biblical scholar, you can educate us on what the Bible says marriage is and marriage is not.
So how does the Bible define marriage? I don't think it does.
Okay. Case closed.
You can't find in the Bible, this is what marriage is supposed to be. You see it spelled out, or maybe it does define it by the examples of marriages in the Scripture. So the biblical idea of marriage, I think, is it's arranged by the parents. The bride's family must provide a dowry. It's only for heterosexual couples for the purpose of procreation. Now, that doesn't mean that husbands and wives didn't love each other or, weren't attracted to each other. It doesn't mean that. That's just not the reason why people got married. If you loved the one they picked for you, great. If you didn't, you're out of luck.
Yeah.
So I think that maybe is the biblical definition of marriage. Would you say? I mean,
it could be one definition of marriage, yes.
That's the Old Testament version.
Well, I thought it also was, going back to, maybe you said this while I was trying to get on Facebook, but in Genesis 1, when it says, even before the story of Adam and Eve, it says, God created male and female in his image, blessed them and said, be fruitful and multiply, right?
Right.
And the intention of marriage is to be fruitful and multiply.
Right.
Come together as one, right? And he said then in Genesis 2, for this reason a man will leave his father and mother, be united with a wife, and they'll become one flesh, right? And that's, like you said, the Old Testament reasoning or the Old Testament maybe definition of marriage is to become one, be fruitful and multiply.
One flesh, that's in, is that it? That's not in the Old Testament, is it?
It says in Genesis 2, it says that they will become one flesh.
Oh, okay.
That's what it says. Now, I may be paraphrasing it, but...
But for this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife. I think that's in the New Testament. But I'm not sure.
Yes, it could be.
Because I did a lot of researching and writing. So, there's a story in Genesis of a husband and wife, and they don't have any children, and the husband dies. And so biblical law requires that the man's brother has to marry the widow and have children with her to continue his brother's name. And so the story is that this widow, is then handed off to her brother-in-law. Well, the brother-in-law doesn't want to continue his brother's name, so it says he spilled his seed, and he died, and so she got married off to the next brother-in-law. He did the same thing. He died, and so she went through until, I don't know if there were any left. Maybe there was one left, and they were like, okay, you're just gonna have to wait for him. He's too young, because they were afraid that he would die too. So,
So it's more of I guess I didn't think about this till you. I guess I'm aware of that story, but I did not consider that as marriage was seen more of a legal obligation for a male to provide for a woman, because at the time, women were
property.
Yeah, were property. Yes, exactly like you said. Yes, that's a better term of what I was going to say.
Yeah.
Yes.
And the woman's job was to have children, and if she couldn't have children, that was grounds for divorce. Even though we don't know that it was her fault or problem,
Yeah.
It was never thought of, perhaps it's the man's issue,
and
maybe he's the one.
That gets in, I think Ashley made this comment. So for some reason Facebook decided to not show the comments anymore, but she said, weren't there often multiple wives and concubines? And I think that feeds into that, right? If the female was not able to provide offspring, then...
So if we want to, look at biblical examples of marriage in the Old Testament, Solomon had his 700 wives and 300 concubines. Why? I don't know. Abraham agreed to sleep with Hagar, who was his wife's slave. Jacob was tricked into marrying Leah, the sister of the woman he was engaged to. And so then he served for another 7 years so that he could marry Rachel. And I'm sure that household was just really jolly to live in.
7 years of that too, right?
And and so Rachel and Leah were always jealous of each other. And David had multiple wives and concubines. I don't think it gives a number. And some of that, the more status and wealth you had, the more wives and concubines you could have. So, yeah.
So the Old Testament really doesn't do a good example of marriages, one woman and one man united, except for Adam and Eve. They were the first and only We'll say,
well, as far as we know.
yeah.
Yeah.
That's true.
And then there's the story of David, who there was a married couple, and the husband was off at war. David saw Bathsheba and wanted to sleep with her, and just had her brought to him so he could sleep with her because he was the king and you didn't tell him no. And then she got pregnant, and so he eventually had her husband sent to the front line of the battle and killed. And then he took her as one of his wives. So he had at least 8 that I think that are named. But anyway.
So the Old Testament does, there are different renditions of marriages, right? It could be, there's Adam and Eve. You could argue whether they were, mutual or what's the term? I don't know. Non-polygamous. I don't know what the term is.
Oh, monogamous.
Monogamous, yeah, sorry. That, or you got the polygamy of the patriarchs at the time. You have arranged marriages as well, right? There's various, there's not one set of standards for biblical marriage in the Old Testament. What about the New Testament? It seems like, as far as I can recall from where it was brought up in the Gospels or even in some of the letters, it seems like there were more monogamous relationships, at least at that, of what I can think of. I'm not aware of most people talking about having multiple wives at that time. That's more of an Old Testament. I don't know, unless you can think of some.
I don't know exactly what the norms were for marriage in the New Testament time, but I'm sure that a man would have a wife to bear children and take care of the household. But he may also have like a mistress, or he could have a young boy that he had a sexual relationship with.
I guess Jesus' parents were monogamous, right? Joseph and Mary, Joseph didn't have any.
Yeah, and because, if for no other reason, that he probably couldn't afford to have any more wives. So some of it had to do with how
Plus, Jesus was the Son of God. You don't want to be like that in front of the Son of God, right? Okay, so I guess the thing is for this, I guess the question is, we go through this and there's not one set way. So where do we go from the interpretation that some Christian communities have is the Bible says that marriage is only between a man and a woman? Is it go to that Ephesians verse where they talk about husbands and wives and how they should have a relationship like Christ and the church? Or how does this come in? Because it seems like if you look at the Old Testament, it's like, biblical marriage could be a vast variety of things, right?
Well, and I think in the Old Testament times, it was about making people.
Yes.
Because the more people you had in your group, the safer you were.
Yep.
So that was the main purpose of being married. And, it was more of a business deal than, there was not really any romance involved. Maybe there was, I don't know. We have the Song of Solomon, Song of Songs. That's, there's a lot of different interpretations on what that means too. This is where it's Ephesians 31, for this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. And yes, it's Genesis 2:24. So this passage in Ephesians 5, 21 to 33, I think it's really interesting because people that are patriarchal in their thinking, they always skip verse 21, which says, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. They skip that. They go right to, wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands. It's like, see, it says right there, you're supposed to submit to me.
Well, because it's a separate section, right?
You are not supposed to oppose me.
The section of husbands and wives starts in 22, at least in my book.
Well, not mine.
Oh, see? Really? Yeah. Instructions for Christian. What version of the Bible you?
NIV.
This is NIV as well. So.
Well, it just
shows you how much different. Yeah, that's interesting.
The section headings weren't in the originals, so somebody has to decide where to put them. So this is not, if you read the whole thing, if you take it out of context, you go, well, there you go, wives submit to your husbands, period. But if you read the whole thing, it was such a radical concept for that time because women were not, there were some women who were business owners, but, most women had to obey their husbands and, do it. They couldn't own property or whatever, So this was a radical idea, this submitting to one another in marriage. And it's a high bar for husbands to love their wives as Christ loves the church, because Christ went to the cross for us. So, that is a high bar. Love their wives as their own bodies. That was new. That was a new idea because, women and children were just kind of like possessions. So, and this whole passage is just this beautiful picture of this mutual respect and caring for each other. The husband and wife leaving their childhood homes to make a new home. They're sometimes like in-laws want to, have impact, and sometimes one of the spouses will defer to their family. And, I think this is saying, hey, this is a new family, even if it's just the two of them and they don't have children, they're still a family. And, they need to defer to each other. And that's what he's getting at there. And becoming one indicates respecting each other, not that two people are absorbed into one. It's not like, well, now the woman doesn't have any identity because she's been absorbed into the man. They're one. Both partners are still autonomous and individuals, but they are committed to this mutual, relationship. So that's what I think of the Ephesians passage, is that it would have been kind of shocking to people then.
Now, let me ask this too. So, we talked about the Old Testament, whether, depending on the examples of different marriages, as far as I can recall, everything is basically a man and a woman married, or a man and multiple females, in a relationship. The New Testament, my heading clearly says husbands and wives. Yours does not say that. It doesn't specify. Nope. It just says Christian households. But it talks about wives submitting to your husbands. And I guess the question then is the Bible prescribing divine norms by saying, because all the examples in the Old Testament are men and male and female, this is clearly saying wives and husbands. Is the Bible prescribing this is what the normal relationship needs to be? Or is it just describing that was the standard human practice at the time? Was majority of relationships were male and female, mostly because of needing to procreate.
Yeah, and that was the norm.
Yes.
That was the norm.
So, yeah.
Because they didn't know what we know now.
Yeah.
And God's design for procreation required the male and female genes or hormones or whatever. I'm not a scientist. I'm not a mathematician. I'm not a scientist. But, but that's not always the case in nature. And some living animals can produce offspring by themselves. Also, some can change sexes. Now, that was in Jurassic Park.
It was. I was bringing that up as well. I'm glad you brought that up. I was going to.
Science bears it out that some species can do that
because they accidentally used the frog DNA to fill in the gaps, and frogs are known. Yeah.
Yeah, and apparently that's true. It's not just movie magic. So, when we know better, we do better, and we now know that the earth isn't flat. We know the earth is round. We now know that, you know, sanitary conditions mean less people die. And so we know this about sexuality and gender. We know that it's not, it's just not clean cut. And there was a really good article that I read by a scientist who explained how you could get the diversity in gender.
And we'll get to that in another Josh Winters
Yeah,
Why.
okay.
Yes.
Because it's pretty long.
Yeah.
But I read that and I was like, oh, well, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
All to do with the chromosomes and all that. So,
So the key thing is, I guess, as far as we believe is the Bible was just describing human practice at the time. It wasn't saying God was saying, the only people that can be in a relationship are male and female, right?
Right.
It's not. It wasn't the fact that there is no examples of. I mean, yes, there are some examples of kings that were going after young boys or something, writing love letters to them, but there's no relationship of same-sex couples.
Just kings.
Yes.
If you had the means and the money, you could do that. And I don't know if you're ready to go there yet.
Go where?
What Paul said about same-sex couples.
Oh, I don't know. We can go there.
I see notes in there.
Did Ashley have a question? My comment stopped.
Oh.
Are there other comments? I want to get to any more comments.
Well, Tony said that Adam and Eve probably got a tax break for being married.
Yeah.
So.
It's a good point. That's the reason I got married.
Maybe they went
tax break.
Maybe they went out in a field and jumped the broom. Ashley says that she's been to weddings where the Ephesians scripture is quoted, and then the importance of man and woman is preached upon mid-ceremony. So.
I did want to say, before we move on to Paul, the Ephesians, I think one thing also that is interesting is that, and I think as you look through this, and one of the studies or one of the things I found was the key takeaways from the Ephesians passage are, if you look at what the relationship should embody, should be a covenant, should be faithfulness, sacrificial love, right? Mutual respect. And if you just pull those out, the question is, can same-sex couples embody those same core values as opposite sex couples? Of course, yes. The fact that they say husbands and wives that was just I don't want to say social norm, but that was the overwhelming, those were what the relationships at the time, right?
Verse 21, submit to one another.
Yeah, if you just take out husbands and wives, it can apply to same-sex marriages.
It could apply to your relationship with your friend or your parent or your neighbor. Submit to one another, and that's not easy, but that's what he's getting at. As Christ loved the church, we should love each other.
Yeah. So I guess the question is, how should churches teach about marriage in a changing culture, and how to, the culture now is not the culture that it was 2,000 years ago when they wrote Ephesians, right? And I guess, how should the church properly teach about marriage, and, is there a right way or wrong way, or does it really matter?
And Ashley said Jesus often used examples that were relevant to the time and people he was speaking to.
That's a good point, yes.
And, so that's what we have to keep in mind. Like I said, we know the earth is round now. How do we interpret this in our own time? Because, I think I was saying this to you earlier, Christians can accept the science of COVID, of global warming, of, all kinds of things, but they can't accept the science of gender and sexuality. But it's there.
Yeah.
And I think the church needs to teach on marriage just as Paul did in comparing Christ and the church to husband and wife. I don't know that the church needs to teach on marriage. I mean, that's just
That's
me
okay.
personally.
Okay, that's fair.
I don't teach on marriage because it's like, oh well, some of you today will have nothing to, nothing to take away from
That's
this
fair.
because
Yeah,
you're not married.
yeah.
I don't do that.
Yep.
But if I'm like meeting with a couple that I'm going to marry, then that's what I would teach on, the mutual respect and the covenant together, and whether or not you're married, like I said, the same thing apply to how we treat everyone. Loving neighbor as yourself, loving each other as you love your own body, submitting to one another, mutual respect.
So if I look at, there's a Pew Research study that was done back in 2019, 2020 to show what, in the places where same-sex marriages are legal, how many married same-sex couples are there? And it said, so I'll just give the stat before I give the U.S. So at the time of the study, same-sex marriage was legal in 30 countries. And in those countries, the percent of same-sex marriages ranged from less than 1% to 3.4% of all marriages. The country that had the most was Spain, and I think that's because same-sex marriage became legal so earlier back in 2005. The U.S. specifically, it says, so the Census Bureau estimates that as of 2021, married couple households that involve same-sex couples was about 1.2% of all married couples in the U.S. So just so you know, there are at the time, there are 61 million married households in the U.S. That meant only 700,000 of them, roughly, were same-sex marriages. So it's a small percentage, like 1 to 2% of all married couples are same-sex. Why is the church making such a big deal about why that's wrong, right? I mean, what's the harm in that?
Well, as Ashley says, we Christians sure do like to pick and choose what we are flexible on.
Exactly. Go after the big things, not the, this is like, I mean, to be honest, now maybe also you could argue, maybe also the numbers would be higher if it was more accepted as our culture. And I think besides just Christians, just maybe culture in general, there are people that disagree with it, that condemn it. And maybe if it's more accepting, maybe people that maybe felt scared of their lives or scared of their safety, they could come out, not be closeted anymore, come out, and maybe those numbers would be higher. But
there are a lot of places in the U.S. where it's not safe.
But still, the percentage is so low, then why is it such a big deal that Christian communities will go behind that to try to help bring them together and say, we all need to disagree with this, and, it's a stronger bond for the U.S. if it's, a male and female in the relationship, right?
And it's like we don't... To say that, there's this biblical standard, and it should be our standard in the country that people, have heterosexual marriages and have a lot of kids. And I think that's very hurtful, because there are people who would like to have children, who would like to be married, but that's not how it worked out. And and then there are people who choose not to have children. And if you don't want to have children, I don't want you to have children, because they're a pain in the neck. So we don't like the polygamy of the FLDS, but isn't what they're doing biblical?
Yeah.
Would you say that was, their arranged marriages, including older men to minor girls, is that biblical marriage? We don't like that. We don't want that to be the standard. So I'm not sure where people, find, well, the biblical family looks like this. And I don't know if I want to go there. I don't know if I want to.
We're running low on time, so maybe we can table that.
I'll probably just save that. But and there are there's no evidence that children raised by LGBTQ plus parents aren't thriving. They do.
Yeah.
There's no difference, and There are no unplanned pregnancies in same-sex couples. So if they want children, they have to be really committed to want children. And a lot more same-sex couples adopt from foster care than do heterosexual couples. It takes a lot of effort for them to have a child.
Yeah.
So, of course, they're going to, cherish that child and care for it. And, there's this idea that gay people try to convert other people to be gay, which is just not true.
Yeah, I think
it just doesn't happen. It's not a club.
Yeah.
They don't get points, for turning somebody gay. It doesn't work like that, and it doesn't work like that with same-sex parents and their children.
And that's what I found a study that was done. 2019 was when it came out, but it said that. This study showed that they studied, and starting in 1986, they studied a group of lesbian parents and their offspring from conception to adulthood. And what they found was that compared to just an overall survey of all kids in that same age group, these kids were more likely, slightly, to identify as LGBTQIA+, right? So I think, and one of the reasons which is interesting for that is not because their parents were gay, so they end up being gay as well. It's because the LGBTQIA parents seem to be more non-judgmental and more attuned to their feelings and accepting of them. Whereas, kids of heterosexual marriages, some of them probably still feel less safe, and they stay closeted with their feelings and urges, and it could also turn into they get married to an opposite sex, and it's a ruined marriage because they're not in it for they're just in it for the act, I guess, to keep up appearance.
And I think that so there are way more divorces than same-sex marriages, and Tony said, I don't think Jesus ever said anything about homosexuality or same-sex marriage, which some people will say, well, that's because it just wasn't accepted at that time, and so of course he wouldn't talk about it. But he did mention something about divorce, not that divorce is wrong.
Yeah.
Jesus was focused on if a man just decides he doesn't like his wife anymore and divorces her, she's out on the street. She's got nothing.
Yeah.
And Jesus was like, no, you can't do that. Not that, because I don't think God expects us to live with our mistakes. If we have married someone and they are abusive, or you're just not good together, you're making each other miserable, I don't think you are supposed to stay in that. And I don't think that's what God intends for us. So, what was the question? Was there a question?
Was there a question?
I don't know. I got distracted by the comments, which are great.
We're just talking about the offspring of same-sex couples and how nothing says that they're psychologically damaged or they turn out gay, but they turn out gay from their own choice because it's a more welcoming, the parents are more
there may not
open-minded.
Be any difference.
Yes.
In the
that's a fair point. Yes.
Of kids from either heterosexual or same-sex couples, it's just that they don't feel safe to say they are. I think the church for a long, long time has been so fixated on sex, and this fear that young people are going to act on their sexual urges and bad things are going to happen, and so they're so worried about that they really fixate on it, and like the anti-LGBTQ plus, or like purity balls and purity rings, and there's a very narrow view on the gift of sex, and there are some groups of Christians who teach girls you have to dress like this, you can't dress like that, because boys can't control themselves, so you have to help them, which is really bad. And
so I grew up in South Carolina, right in the same town as Bob Jones University. Not sure if you know Bob Jones University, but it's a very religious college, and they have there are different sidewalks for the male and female to walk on, because they can't walk on the same sidewalk. If they go on a date, they can't hold hands, and they need to be chaperoned on the date,
right?
Because the man can't control his urges, so you can't.
Right.
Just stay away.
I mean, doesn't that irritate you that that's how men are thought of? Like they're just some animals, and they but it's all up to the girl.
But it's the girl's fault, right? The man can't control his urges.
And I think if we're going to be fixated on sex as Christians, let's be fixated on the rampant sexual abuse happening in churches, not just the Catholic Church, churches, and within heterosexual marriages. And nobody wants to deal with that.
Yeah.
And you can be, an abuser, and but it's the wife should have tried harder, or she shouldn't have irritated him, or that kind of stuff just keeps it going, and we don't look at that and say, no, that's wrong. If there's a same-sex couple, that's not wrong. This
I'd be curious to get if you do the percentages, right? Percentage of heterosexual marriages that have abuse or abusive relationship, I'm sure it's more than 1.2% of all marriages, right?
Yes, sadly.
So let's focus on the high percentages of problems and not just this made up concern.
Because is a heterosexual relationship, is it always right? No, because there are times when there's no consent. Yeah, it's still a heterosexual relationship, but there was no consent, or it's abusive. So sometimes it's even if you're differently sexed couple, it's wrong. So I think it would be really nice if people minded their own business about what people are doing in their bedroom, and if we could stop spending time worrying about and fighting about LGBTQ plus folks, and just spend more time.
If it's not harming you, then don't. I mean, they're not harming anybody. It's not.
No, I don't care if it's same-sex or heterosex. There has to be mutual consent, and mutual respect, and no abuse going on. I don't care who you're with, as long as it's it's not a minor, and there's consent and mutual respect. And I think that's what Paul's talking about in Ephesians. And also, by the way, Paul said it's better to be single like I am. So,
well, Paul liked to brag a lot too.
Well, he did, but he was just saying.
You should be like me. I'm single. You should try to be like Paul.
But he did say if you can't keep your hands to yourself, then you probably should go ahead and get married. But there's no shame in being single. There's no shame in being childless. So I guess that's how I feel about the idea of biblical marriage.
That's good. Good in a nutshell. We had a good discussion. It went longer than normal. Thank you for all you that stayed around to the end of this discussion. So hope you had a good time listening to this discussion. I know there's been a lot of good comments made. I'll have to check them. My phone has not been acting up for me. But looking forward, this Thursday we'll be back with another Digging Deep. We're off last week because you're on annual conference. We'll be back next Monday. So we'll take a break next Monday to talk about unpacking issues that reasons people may bring up they disagree with the LGBT community. Because next Thursday, I believe, is Juneteenth. So I want to change gears because June is both Pride Month but also Juneteenth. And I want to address Juneteenth, and I want to talk about what the Bible says about slavery and how did slave owners justify the Bible to say what they were doing was right. And also talk about the censored Bibles that the slave owners would give to their slaves that sort of cut out all the, the good news about freedom and the Exodus and stuff, right? So we'll chat about that as well as the origins of Juneteenth next week. And then the following week we'll be back and talk about, Kelly alluded to that, is someone really born gay or do they turn gay? And we want to unpack that to understand, Genesis clearly says man and woman and, made in our image, so we can't be born gay, right? I'm joking, but let's unpack that in a couple weeks.
Let's unpack that in a couple weeks.
So that's two things to look forward to for the upcoming Josh Wonders Why. If there's anything else that you'd like to, us to talk about or like us to address or unpack, feel free to put them in a post or comments, and we'd love to talk about them. So thank you all again for watching. Thank you, Kelly, for giving us all the answers. As always, it's very insightful.
I don't have all the answers. I do feel like I had a lot of answers tonight, though.
You did. This is good.
Whether they're right or wrong, they're just my answers.
There you go.
These are my perspectives.
That's good. So thanks again for watching us. We'll see you again later this week, and have a good rest of your night.
Good night.